Hi, everybody. Welcome to our second look at Christianity. And we were thinking last time about Jesus, the problem of Jesus. Who was Jesus? And there's so much disagreement about that. But you know what? You know what everybody agrees on? The best place to start is with the Gospels right there in the New Testament. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And that's what we're going to look at in this video today. So when you look at the four Gospels in the order in which they were written, in chronological order, which is not the order in which they appear in your Bible, right? In your Bible, it's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But if we shuffle them into the order in which they were written, the first one is Mark, then comes Matthew, then comes Luke, then comes John. So flip the first two. And why that matters is because when you do put them in chronological order and you read them, certain things kind of jump out. Certain things become clear. Namely, that the four Gospels present an evolving portrait of Jesus. Each one portrays Jesus in a unique way, even though they, of course, overlap a great deal. But each one has its own point of view, its own voice, and I want to get into some of those details with you. And when we put them in order, we see Jesus evolving from a simple, more human spiritual teacher to, by the time we get to the Gospel of John at the end, a fully blown divine being. So let's trace that through the four Gospels. There's a couple of things we want to take a look at first, though. The Gospels were written between the years 70 and 100 CE. So, in other words, you recall, Jesus died in about 29 CE. Let's call it 30 CE. And so there's a 40-year gap between the death of Jesus in the year 30 and somebody putting pen to paper to tell the story of Jesus, and that would be the Gospel of Mark, in the year 70. And you recall from our earlier videos on Judaism, 70 was the year that the temple was destroyed. Jerusalem was destroyed. It was an apocalypse of epic proportions for Judaism. Somebody must have looked around and said, well, the world is ending. The temple's destroyed. The Romans are slaughtering us all. I better write the story of this Jewish teacher called Jesus. And perhaps that was the motivation for someone to put pen to paper to write that first gospel, the Gospel of Mark. By the way, that year, 70 CE, that's not when the Jesus movement begins. The Jesus movement has been going on from Jesus's life on. It just didn't have gospels yet. In fact, there was a guy called Paul, who we'll talk about later, who was already running around and teaching and writing stuff, the letters of Paul that he wrote to all these far-flung communities of Jesus followers. Those letters are in your New Testament too. And those letters were written between, I think, 45 and 62. So those would be your first Christian documents, testimonies that we have. The Gospels come after the letters of Paul, and were undoubtedly influenced by them. More on Paul later. I mean, his impact on everything Christian is really incalculable. It's so important. But today our topic is the Gospels. So we have that 40-year time gap that Jesus died around 30 and the first gospel was written in 70. So that's 40 years. And in those days, that was a lifetime. That was an average lifetime for working class people. So we'll come back around to that. The question is, are the Gospels then just based on word of mouth accounts? Would word of mouth recollections of Jesus's quotes and the events of Jesus and the disciples and their life, would that just be passed word by word orally through that 40-year period, through 4 decades, and then finally get written down by this guy? Or, and this is what scholars generally agree on, there were probably written accounts that we no longer have of at least the quotations, the parables of Jesus, and maybe some of the accounts of the disciples too. Those sources are called Q, which is short for Quelle in German, meaning source. So Quelle is this hypothetical text, this speculative text that we don't have, that helps us account for how the Gospels got written so many decades after the facts that they describe. Here's another challenge. The word gospel in Greek means good news. And so the editorial stance of the authors of the Gospels. They are not dispassionate historians describing this teacher's life and his teachings and what happened. These are insiders writing persuasion pieces. They wrote the Gospels to change your mind about the nature, the mission, and the purpose of Jesus. They're trying to convince us, the Gospels are, that Jesus is God and that his presence on earth is necessary for the redemption of humankind. It's a tall order. And so that's why they're called the good news. And that's why it's probably best to read the Gospels with that in mind, that that's the purpose of the people who sat down to write these things. They're not journalists just talking about a story. They're pitching a whole ideology. Now, given that 40-year gap, we have some problems in authorship and in dating. First of all, let's deal with the authorship question. Traditionally, maybe if you're a little kid and you grew up in Sunday school, you were taught that the Gospels were written by the disciples whose names they bear. Mark was written by Mark, Matthew was written by Luke, John was written by John, and so on. But that's not really what we think anymore. It's again, all of these claims that I'm sketching for you are contested, are disputed. There's tons of different positions on this. I'm trying to go kind of like down the middle path here. This is what most scholars, both in the Christian world and outside of it, agree about the dating and authorship of the Gospels. That first Gospel, Mark, was written around 70, and so that's 40 years after Jesus. Could Mark still have been alive? It's possible, but it becomes less and less likely as we move on through the other Gospels. Matthew was written 75 to 80, Luke around 85, John 90 to 100. It's a stretch to think that the disciples are still even alive at that time, let alone that they are the authors of these texts. There's a second reason we don't think that these are first-person accounts. There's no first-person reporting in the Gospels. You would think that Matthew, for example, might say, "And then I said to Jesus, and Jesus said to me, and then Jesus and I walked to the next town." There's no first-person author. It's all third-person omniscient. Matthew said to Jesus, and Jesus said to Matthew, and then Matthew and Jesus walked to the next town. Why would Matthew talk that way? Now, that alone doesn't prove anything, but it's another straw. It's another piece of evidence that weights heavily toward the claim that the authors of the Gospels are not the disciples, not the eyewitnesses. Does that matter? Probably not. It's quite common in the ancient world, as happens in Buddhism all the time, for devotees of a spiritual tradition to write a treatise, a sutra, a gospel, and attribute it to their teacher. So it's very possible that Matthew and Mark and Luke and John were written by the students of those disciples. Now, all of this discussion on authorship hinges on the dating. How did we come up with those dates? Because as Bart Ehrman points out in his book, Misquoting Jesus, the oldest complete copy of the Gospels is from the 3rd century. And before that, we just have fragments and pages and accounts and bits and pieces scattered in the archives of the world. And Bible scholars like Bart Ehrman go scampering around into these archives and put together what they can put together. So that's part of the challenge here, is just figuring out how we came up with these these dates. And so really it comes down to a linguistic detective story. We know that language changes very quickly from decade to decade. Like here we are, the word tweet, now we know what that means. Tweeting means posting a few phrases on Twitter. But 10 years ago, Twitter didn't exist. And so if you would have said, I'm going to tweet that, nobody would know what you're talking about. Maybe you're going to make sounds like a little bird. So 500 years from now, scholars will be able to look back and date our documents to a specific decade because we're all talking about Twitter. So too in archaic Greek, in ancient Greek, in first century Greek. New words come in, spellings change, grammar changes, and linguistic scholars can date a text quite accurately by the grammar and the syntax of the language used in that text. So this is one of the tools that we use to date these texts. And again, these techniques are not without their disputes. But I think the argument is largely settled on the dating of these Gospels. Now, Mark, as I said before, was the first Gospel written around 70 when the temple fell. It's short, it's compact, it shows a very human Jesus. You know what's missing from the Gospel of Mark? The birth story. There's no birth story. The opening scene is the baptism of Jesus. He's 30 years old. He's being baptized in the Jordan River by his cousin John the Baptist. That's how the Gospel of Mark opens. There's nothing about his birth, his childhood, or any of that stuff. It just tells the story from his baptism to his death, those last 2.5 years of his life. Now, when we get to the second Gospel, the Gospel of Matthew, written around 75 to 80, this is when we have the first birth story. Now, either Mark didn't know about the birth story or he didn't think it mattered. We can only guess. That it seems clear that he didn't know. I mean, it's a pretty great story. Wouldn't you put it in? Yeah. And so Matthew uses 90% of Mark. So it seems clear that Matthew, whoever wrote Matthew, had a copy of Mark on his desk, and it all comes in. But the stories get richer, they get more detailed. Mark tells us that after Jesus was baptized, he went to the desert and fasted for 40 days and 40 nights where he was tempted by Satan. But Matthew takes that same story and gives us much more detail. He tells us the whole transcript of the dialogue between Satan and Jesus, the 3 temptations. So Matthew is getting better information, or the stories are becoming more elaborate, whatever interpretation you care to land on. Matthew is also the most Jewish of the Gospels, and that's another fascinating feature. Each of the Gospels seems to be directed toward a specific audience. Luke, the one we'll talk about next, seems to be directed toward a Greek or Gentile, non-Jewish audience, but Matthew is a direct communique to the Jewish lineage, and it makes the case that Jesus is a descendant of King David. That's a box you've got to check if this Messiah, Jesus, is really the Jewish Messiah. So Matthew's working hard to make the case that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah. The third gospel is the Gospel of Luke, written around 85 CE. This too has a birth story like Matthew. This is the famous birth story that everybody reads at Christmas. And it uses about 50% of the Gospel of Mark. Now, the fourth Gospel is different. It's John, and it was written quite late as 90 or 100 CE. And so those first 3 Gospels, Mark, Matthew, Luke, we collectively know those as the synoptic Gospels. From the Greek, syn means to, S-Y-N means to, like synthesize, right? To blend together, and optic means to see. So synoptic means that the first 3 Gospels share the same perspective. They see things the same. There's a lot of alignment between those first 3. Over 450 passages are the same between those first 3 Gospels. But John pivots and goes another way. So John is a departure from the synoptic tone and its themes and its content. Jesus is really changing now. He's becoming more spiritual, more divine. And in the Gospel of John, for the first time, we see two new doctrines that we have not seen before in the previous three Gospels. One of them is called identity, the doctrine of identity, and the other one's called the doctrine of preexistence. So the doctrine of identity is the claim that the Son and the Father are the same thing. We're not quite yet to the full-blown Trinity yet. That comes right after this period. But in the Gospel of John, we get the unmistakable pitch that Jesus is not just a messenger from the Father. He doesn't just speak for or represent the Father, that the Son and the Father are one thing, identical. And that goes hand in hand with that other doctrine, the pre-existence doctrine. In fact, the Gospel of John starts with that famous line, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." And the word there in Greek, because the Gospels were written in Greek, is logos. And logos means word, but it also means order, pattern, structure. It comes to be understood by early Jesus followers in the Gospel of John as Jesus himself, that Jesus is the logos made flesh, the Word made flesh. So in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. There's that pre-existence and that identity. So in much Christian consciousness, because of the Gospel of John, Jesus is God. There's no difference between the two. And Jesus has always existed. Jesus isn't just this human rabbi who lived for 30 odd years and then died. He is an eternal being who was there at the dawn of creation and will be there until the end of time. Now we're seeing the monotheism of Judaism split up a little bit. Now, to be fair, Christians claim still to be monotheists. They simply acknowledge that their God is a tripartite God that appears in three forms: the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Just as we did in the Hindu tradition, that all is Brahman, but Brahman, like white light through a prism, scatters into all of these varieties and colors. But behind the surface, it's all still a unity. That's what's going on here also. And so one quick way to wrap up this idea of the evolving portrait of Jesus is to look at Jesus's dying words on the cross in all four of these Gospels. It's pretty remarkable. In the first Gospel, as Jesus is dying on the cross, in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus cries out, "Father, why have you forsaken me?" Forsaken means abandoned. So here's a very human Jesus saying, "Hey, God, I'm getting killed. We were working together on something. I'm getting killed here. Could I get a little help? Where are you now? You have abandoned me." So that's a very human Jesus who doesn't understand why he's being killed. Then we get to the Gospel of Matthew, the second Gospel. And as I said before, Matthew uses Mark pretty much whole cloth. So here Jesus says the same thing as he's dying on the cross in the Gospel of Matthew. "Father, why have you forsaken me?" But then we get to the third Gospel, the Gospel of Luke. Look what happens. Look what shifts. Jesus is dying on the cross, and he says something that signals to me a kind of acceptance. Jesus says, "Into thy hands I commit my spirit." Not arguing, not crying out for God, not complaining that God is absent. He simply, as he dies, says, "Into thy hands I commit my spirit." That's an entity, that's a being who understands why he's on the cross. But look how the Gospel of John does it. Here in the Gospel of John, where we have a full-blown divine being, Jesus as God, and he says exactly what you would expect he would say as he's dying on the cross. Dying on the cross is not a mistake. God is orchestrating this whole thing. He sent himself down in human form, Christians claim, to be ritually killed. And in this sacrificial death, a paradigm very familiar in the Jewish world, the scapegoat, the sacrificial lamb, Jesus steps into that role knowingly, the Gospel of John claims. And so God, in the form of Jesus on the cross, dying, simply says, "It is finished. It is done. What I came to do, I did, and I did it." And so we have in the four Gospels and this fascinating portrait of a spiritual teacher going from a kind of human teacher to the fully blown divine redeemer of all of the sin in the world through his sacrificial death on the cross. But what's missing from our story still is the Apostle Paul, who was not part of the original crew of 12 disciples. In fact, Paul never met Jesus. They never crossed paths, although they are contemporaries. And yet it is Paul who put pen to paper first before the Gospels were written and was already running around teaching Jesus the Redeemer to audiences that had never heard such a thing before. So when we get back together on the other side, let's take a look at the Apostle Paul, some of the doctrines that he set forth and his enormously influential impact on everything that was to follow.